This is Dr. Jacqueline Duget, and you're listening to What is Black Podcast, where we have conversations about raising African American children and the intersection of race, culture, and identity.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our discussion about raising kids and the discussion about corporal punishment. I have 2 special guests with me today. I have pediatricians Dr. Michelle Ogle and Dr. Shontae Buffington joining us this evening. So welcome, Dr. Ogle and Dr. Buffington.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. I had mentioned earlier that this is a part 2 of a conversation. Part 1 of the conversation, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Stacy Patton, who's a historian, who's very much an advocate against corporal punishment. She talks about the historical context of corporal punishment and thoughts that there are alternatives and works to try to advocate for alternatives to corporal punishment. Now, the AAP policy statement came out in November, and as part of the AAP, it was just very interesting and intriguing some of the reactions to the policy statement, effective discipline to raise healthy children. And I wanted an opportunity because I think it's such an important issue in the African American community. I think in a lot of communities, but I think the data shows that most parents, different racial ethnic groups do favor or think that spanking is an acceptable disciplinary alternative, whereas the AAP definitely says they're not supportive of corporal punishment. So I kind of wanted to have that discussion. So before we actually get into the discussion, I just wanted Dr. Ogle and Dr. Buffington to give you an opportunity to sort of share your background for our listeners.
Well, just for my background, I am a mother of 3 adult children. I have a 24-year-old son who's an attorney. I have a 22-year-old daughter who just graduated from Boston University. And I have a just turned 21-year-old son who's a computer science major at Clemson University. So I've gone through the whole, gamut with raising children. I primarily provide care for adolescents and young adults with HIV. I don't take care of small children in a general pediatric practice anymore. I've totally focused my career on young adolescent and youth at risk living with HIV, which also includes young LGBTQ kids and trans kids as well. So that's sort of the background I'm coming from. My husband is also a physician. He is from Guyana. So we sort of have 2 different upbringings, but when as we talked during our conversation, we were brought up very much the same. Even though we're from different countries, we were brought up very much the same. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
And I am also a mother. I have 2 children, and I've been married for almost 20 years. My husband's not a physician. He's normal. I have a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old. And we are kind of an East Coast, West Coast family. So I was raised in Atlanta, but did all of my training on the West Coast, which there's a lot of, we can get into that later, but viewpoints differ from coast to coast. So I had to learn a lot of different cultural aspects to discipline and raising kids and eating and all kinds of things. So by training, I probably have a very Californian viewpoint, but at my roots, I'm a Southerner. My husband's a Californian. So it's interesting also that even though we're from different coasts, we have very similar modes of disciplining. So that's just kind of one of those things where it's like, you grew up with this very liberal viewpoint, but yet and still we kind of agree on that in particular.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. So I'd really like to get into the conversation. One of my first questions was, what were your reactions to the updated policy statement?
Well, usually I ignore pretty much any thread that comes through. I will be a very observant reader on the outside, but I usually don't have a lot of input to put into those multi-threads. But the more I read and the more I read the link, I think I was somewhat infuriated as a parent to read maybe what someone else's perspective of an entire group of people would be like. And so I felt compelled to respond, even though it put my name out there and everything else. I just felt like there were things that were not being said in that policy and that email thread, and I felt like it only reflected the majority maybe of the country, but it leaves out a lot of things that were not being discussed in the policy statement.
Yeah, and I'm going to also add on to that in saying I had a couple of responses. One was, who made the decision that corporal punishment was bad? And how did you come up with such a broad policy statement? And it's not just that it says corporal punishment. The statement is so broad in what it considers corporal punishment. Yelling at a child, shaming a child, of course, hitting them, tapping them, pinching them. If you try to get them to do something out of their norm, so for example, if one of my forms of discipline may be to get a kid to do 30 push-ups. Well, if you can only do 10, then I'm being abusive, and as a form of corporal punishment, if I'm trying to make a child do something out of what they may normally do. And so, like Dr. Buffington, I felt that the way this policy was worded and the way it was being viewed was that a whole culture of people, and I'll just, be quite blunt, it read to me like, so Black and brown people, your children have problems, and the reason why your children has all these problems is because of the way you discipline them. And I think at that point it was very, very infuriating as a parent, as a pediatrician, as an African-American woman, that our whole entire culture had been reduced to, you guys beat your kids, that's why they're the way they are. And I felt a lot of nuances in the way we raise our children and the combinations of forms that we use in disciplining our children was just totally left out of the equation, and somehow this became a Black parent, you're doing this wrong. And this is, I think it sort of brought up historical context to blaming a culture, blaming Black people for, your plight.
And I also felt like there were certain things that were said, particularly in the article that referenced the AAP policy, that were completely taken out of context.
Okay.
Statements such as, you're going to get a whooping. I grew up in the South. Grandpa would get a switch off a tree, a little twig, and tap you. That was a whooping. But you also may have gotten a tap with an open hand. That was also a whooping. So it's like, well, you can't take statements like that and attribute it all to abuse and say that if this happens and your children are going to have low IQs and low self-esteem. Truth be told, I was spanked. My husband was spanked. My husband's an IT engineer. I'm a pediatrician, and I don't think I had low self-esteem because my mom spanked me. Now, she didn't spank me for every single thing, and that's the other part that completely got left out in the policy. Like, when are Black parents spanking? When are people spanking their children? Now, unlike Michelle, I do take care of young children, and I've done it in private practice, and I've done it in, now I'm in a very poor rural area. I chose to come here. And I've also done it on a university campus. So I've seen this play out in many different socioeconomic and racial demographics. And I can tell you that more parents spank than they are willing to admit. But in that room, when you close the door, oftentimes a parent will tell you Yeah, I had to resort to spanking him. And you know what, Dr. Buffington, that worked, but don't tell fill in the blank. In Georgia, corporal punishment is not as a CPS or a DFACS reportable offense. And in many other states, it's not either. And some of these children need something more corrective than timeout. So I personally think there are so many aspects to that policy that were not discussed.
Now, it's interesting, that you brought up those reactions, and I can definitely could feel that as well, personally. And I even talk with my husband, who's a non-physician, and he sort of had the same take that you all have shared, some of the same opinions, which I found interesting. So I also have older children. I have a 20-year-old now, and I have a 17-year-old. So I'm almost on the other side with adults, saying I have both adult children. And I did spank them when they were younger. Again, but I think what's interesting is there are no parameters for this discipline, right? I think when I was trained, there was no training about talking to parents about spanking, and I think over time there was an evolution about using timeouts and trying other ways to sort of using non-spanking ways. But then there were times where like, well, let me try spanking, but then it got to a point where it either worked for one kid or it didn't work for the other, and then you kind of, as they grow developmentally. So I'm wondering how you feel about that as well. Like you said, there's not really this deep dive into what really is spanking versus whipping versus yelling at your kid. Because I'm like, I yelled at my kids quite often. So it's like, well, that would have been corporal punishment. So that's also very interesting. Right? So.
So I am in total agreement with what's been said, but I want to kind of just broaden this conversation just a little bit, because what probably got under my skin was that there are many forms of parenting. There are many different parenting styles, many different ways people raise their kids, and to single out and say, well, corporal punishment, we're going to focus on that and tell you how bad that is, because majority of black families, and I agree with Dr. Buffington, more people spank their kids than they admit because they don't want to be seen as bad parents or have their kids taken away from them. But there are several different parenting styles, and not all parenting styles work for each type of parent, and not all of those styles work for each kid. And so there are other forms of parenting that I think is just as bad for kids and has bad outcomes as people want to say corporal punishment is. So there's the helicopter parents, there's the permissive parents, and people don't often talk about data that shows that permissive parenting, there are actually a lot of cons to that, and how that often results in kids having low self-esteem, the ability to regulate their behavior, and so on. So I just took it a little bit personal that we picked on, we decided this particular form of parenting was so bad and so toxic and so caustic that the American Academy of Pediatrics had to come out with this blanket statement and deem all parents who use any form of corporal punishment as bad parents. I also agree with the nuances. All three of my children have three different personalities, require three different forms of parenting at different times. And, sometimes you might get a pop-pop. There were certain words that I wouldn't say to my kids because I felt the words were harsh. Like I never said you were going to get slapped or I'm going to beat you. But, my word was pop-pop. I felt it was sort of a nice way of saying you're going to get tapped here if you're not listening to what I'm saying. Each one of my kids responded to that differently. So that required me to have a different response as well in terms of parenting. So I agree that the nuances of being a parent, having different children, having different parenting styles, none of that was taken into account when they made this broad blanketed statement about how bad corporal punishment is.
Now, as both of you, pediatricians, how do you feel this policy will be, the translated into real practice? Because I'm just trying to figure out how. I think it's going to be interesting, right? Because I think again, we're not speaking for all African American parents or Black parents, right? I know we're speaking from our own personal experiences. So, but that's always the one thing for me. It's like, how do things get translated, right? And even talking with Dr. Patton earlier, she shared an article that she wrote, and that the headline was, "Can Pediatricians Convince Black Parents to Stop Spanking?" Mm-hmm. And that was that was a very, very, provocative, it's a very provocative title, but very interesting. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about that? Because again, like you said, there are nuances to parenting and discipline styles, right? Because we all bring to the table our experiences, and they're informed by maybe how we were parented. And then I think we take some of our scientific knowledge and what we learn from residency and medical school, right, and bring that to the table as well. But again, it's kind of like, how do you even teach what's okay spanking, what's not okay spanking? I think maybe that's also a big question too. But then also too, how do we really tell people to stop doing something that's normative for them?
Well, I can tell you right now, it is not going to change anything I do in practice every day. Okay. And part of the reason why is because of the population that I serve. When it comes to just basic things like screen time and bottle use and nutrition, we struggle. We struggle as a group. I think on the lower socioeconomics, regardless of race, we struggle because we economically struggle. We struggle from an educational viewpoint also, but it probably won't change what I do, because generally I don't recommend spanking anyway as a first resort. And I think as a group of pediatricians, if you get a group of pediatricians together, most of them will say that they don't recommend spanking as a primary form of discipline. And guess what? Most people do not primarily spank. We're really talking about a very, very small group of individuals who immediately resort to that, no matter what the offense is. Most of us will try some verbal correction. Timeout works for one of my children, doesn't work for the other one, so I don't do that. And so you have to figure out what works for your child. And I often tell parents that anyway. You have 5 children, you may have 5 different discipline methods. So it's not going to change much of what I say, but there are some kids in my practice that I do recommend that the parent take some corrective measures with, and I do teach them how to do it. And if you want me to tell you what I tell them, I can tell you, but there's a way to do it without really harming your child, but being corrective. And the whole purpose of discipline is love and correction.
And I agree with that. And I'm going to say I agree. The statement doesn't, in the broad picture, affect what I would recommend to anyone. Again, I don't take care of small children anymore. But even in my own practices as a parent, it wouldn't change one thing that I did with my kids. But I do want to also broaden this conversation again just a little bit, because when people often do their research, and I still am never clear how they do the research and where they get all these numbers, but the researchers almost make it appear as though what happens in a home where corporal punishment is used or kids are spanked is that parents come home, they're mad, they're out of control, they're depressed, or they had a bad day and they just come home and beat the life out of their kids. That is clearly unacceptable, And that is clearly not what we're talking about when we're speaking of corporal punishment. I can guarantee you whenever I got spanked when I knew exactly what I was in trouble for. Yep. I knew exactly what I had done, and I knew that the response, it was definitely warranted because I had gone out of bounds. So I want to get away from this notion that people try to paint of parents who discipline their kids or who use corporal punishment, that somehow or another we're all out of control and we don't know how to control ourselves, and we just come home and the best way that we can, deal with whatever pressures we have is just to beat our children. That is clearly abusive, and I don't know one pediatrician that would support that or think that that was a great way to raise kids. It's absolutely the wrong thing to do, and that is abusive. I also want to just kind of look in the broader spectrum of Black parents and Black children. Mm-hmm. If the people who made this statement, if the people who are really championing this statement were Black men or raised Black men, I might be able to kind of understand where they may be coming from. No one except a Black man in this country or parents who raise Black men in this country understand what we deal with on a daily basis with our kids, with our young men or our boys, and how they are perceived by larger society, how they are perceived by people of authority. And so some of the messages that we have to send to our kids and some of the ways that they may have to understand that message doesn't leave room for us to have time to negotiate or to teach them that we can go back and forth on this decision. To just broaden it out a little bit, there is a difference in raising Black children because society treats Black children differently than they do white children with blonde hair and blue eyes.
So in a way, I'm wondering, based on what you're saying, do you think there's an opportunity then that the policy statement does provide in the sense that we could have that conversation about cultural context, right? Because I think that's one piece, that's really missing in the policy statement. And again, it's a general policy statement, so I know it was difficult to kind of tease out, certain, racial group, ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups. Most of the policies have to be very general. But I'm just wondering, do you think there is an opportunity for the AAP to kind of look at how this does get translated into certain communities, especially since we're talking about Black families, and also knowing that how people take it, right? I think historically, if a white doctor might be telling a whole population, or what people might generalize and say they're telling a whole population, you're doing it wrong. People are going to perceive it as we're doing this wrong, but it's been working for us. How do you think there's an opportunity?
Well, I think the opportunity is the American Academy of Pediatrics have pediatricians who are Black and brown, mm-hmm. and who have experiences raising Black and brown children. And we take care of the very population that they're trying to, tell these parents that they're raising their kids wrong. I mean, like we're out here actually in the community taking care of a lot of these kids. And I think to involve us, as a group in the discussion is appropriate. I think to try to understand the cultural nuances and raising our children is important when you make a blanketed statement like that. And basically what the American Academy of Pediatrics has said, and in Dr. Patton's article, it's, how do we get white privileged people who have no concept, really, of what we go through on a day-to-day basis in our homes? Because I've made the point that even though we're pediatricians, so we take care of kids, that's our profession, we are still mothers, we're aunts, we're cousins, we have male relatives. And when we step out of our work environment, people don't look at me or look at my child and say, well, he's a young man, he's an attorney, or this mother is a pediatrician. They see us as Black people, mm-hmm. and they often see our boys as dangerous or threatening. So I think when you don't have that perspective, I think it would behoove the organization to try to understand that perspective before you make a blanketed statement that a whole group of people are somehow derelict in the way that they're raising their children.
And, let's be honest, with other cultural practices, the AAP has written, editorials, articles, all kinds of things, cupping and coining. Mm-hmm. There's lots of practices that Hispanics have that maybe we don't understand, but we do have a better understanding because of these articles that were written. I think the difference is that, and I don't know, you guys may disagree. Sometimes we're not seen as a separate cultural group. We're part of this nation, but then somehow we're not. So, like with the Native Americans and the cupping and coining, they're considered a cultural group. We're kind of not. We're considered a minority group, and when it's convenient, we're a cultural group. So I think it would be difficult to answer your question. It would be difficult because oftentimes we're seen as this group that needs to conform to the mainstream. And if we would just conform, then everything would just be okay. And so I think it would be a struggle because then they would have to also adjust their thinking on many other things that the AAP has essentially ignored African American or black children.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with that, and I'm going to agree with that. And just make one other little quick point on that. I would like to see as much attention given to unarmed black teenagers being shot and killed by police.
Yep. Yep.
I don't see the articles. I mean, where's the Pew Research study that talks about the PTSD that we as a community go through every time a young boy is shot in the back, shot because of what they were wearing, shot because they were misunderstood. So we carry that with us, and we, by default, our kids have to carry it for us mothers and those listening to us that have kids. We have to give our kids the talk. For me, as soon as my kids started driving, I had to make sure that I educated my sons how to behave if you're stopped by police. All this, well, let's give children an opportunity to reason. They're not going to give you an opportunity to reason. They're not going to want to hear a word you say. They're not going to care what you say. So we give them a whole lecture on a posture that these young men must take, and even when they do it right, they still may end up dead. But people don't, I would like to really see the American Academy of Pediatrics. Let's talk about a research study on that and how that's affecting our community and how I may raise my son, or if my son is talking back when I tell him to stop talking, and I've said it 4 times, and then he's going to feel a pop somewhere, it's because you need to understand when I tell you to stop talking, you stop talking, it might save your life. Those are the kind of nuances that if you're not a parent of a black man, a black boy, a black girl, a black young woman, you may not understand that nuance and that message.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a very, very interesting topic. But I also agree with one of your statements earlier, Dr. Ogle, that I think the conversation really is not solely about corporal punishment, because like you said, most pediatricians do not recommend as a first line of discipline to spank, right?
That's right.
So,
right.
And then in terms of other parenting styles, I think even part of our anticipatory guidance, most pediatricians provide a kind of a spectrum of tips for parents, right? So that you don't get to that point. And it's interesting. I know that in part one of this conversation, Dr. Patton is, again, very much an advocate against corporal punishment, and and says that this is violence against kids, and there's this historical or this legacy for the African American community that we utilize a form of discipline that was used by the slave master, right, and then sort of passed down over time. And then again, I think some of the stresses that as African Americans we have, we sort of still bring that into our parents, like, because we still want to protect our kids, and it's like, all right, how do we protect our kids? So that's what's also interesting to me as well, right? Like you said, it's that broader conversation, because when we talk about discipline, right, I think there is an opening to then kind of delve into these other issues as well, looking at maybe other stresses that mom has or dad has or grandma has, that maybe if they're choosing to do spanking first, right, as opposed to another, having other tools in their toolbox, and how to. So I'm just wondering your thoughts about that. Like, what are those opportunities you see as pediatricians yourself, as pediatricians of color, to sort of, again, I think there are other opportunities for how we can help our families and help inform them about their options, but at the same time, also, like you said, very, very much we're aware of these external, institutional racism, just straight up racism in general, how that impacts the parenting and that whole discipline issue, and how we love our children.
Well, I'll go there. Again,
I said a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that's
you did. Well, I was going to narrow it, then maybe Dr. Buffington can piggyback on that. Well, I'd like to again kind of bring it back to a main point, I think, in all of what you brought up. Our children are not raised in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. Our children are not just raised in our home. They have to interact with larger society. They have to interact with other people. And Dr. Buffington made the point, and I would totally agree with it. The message that we hear over and over as Black Americans, as African Americans, is to just conform to our norms. Mm-hmm. If you just be more like this, then you're acceptable. And I think that is a major problem for the reason that she mentioned earlier. But I just want to add on to that. If teachers weren't more likely to suspend Black children at 2 or 3 times the rate for the same activities that white children did, then I might feel differently about it. If Black kids weren't shot for playing with toy guns, I might feel that there's something different we should do about it. If if teachers didn't treat Black kids differently than they did white kids, I would say you have a point there. But the larger point I'm trying to make is that there are external factors mm-hmm. that we don't have control over, and that I feel my job with all 3 of my adult children now is to make sure that they understand how to live in the society that we're in. I would love for it to be that my kid would have the same opportunity to respond to a situation that another child would have, and he would be treated the same, but that's not reality. So we can talk about what we would do or what are some of the things we could do, but my point is that there are external factors that we, this is 2019 now, but we're still talking about the criminal justice system and how our kids and and Black people are arrested and jailed for offenses that are, white people would not be criminalized for. So, I just want to go back to, I think that one of the places the Academy can kind of help itself in trying to help us is to acknowledge it and understand the fact that we have issues that our kids deal with and we deal with as families that they don't deal with.
So in some ways go ahead, Dr. Buffington.
I was going to say that my practice is fairly young. I do have a lot of adolescents, but my practice is fairly young. So this is a conversation that I have every single day. 50% of the population I serve is African American. About 50% is white or other. And I can tell you that regardless of race, people struggle. People in our society struggle with discipline. And one of the reasons why they struggle with discipline is because it's okay to be permissive. And when you are authoritative, you are mean. You're a bad parent. You're perceived as the one who doesn't have control. And I think some of the people who changed viewpoints of parenting, what's his name, Dr. Sears, some of these other pediatricians who have written things about how you should behave with your children and let the child express themselves. And I believe in all that, okay? But I think part of the problem is that from a little age, probably 15, 18 months old, I will see these kids in the office, and the mom is trying to, let's just say, change a diaper. And the kid is just moving all over the table, and I'm thinking, this kid's going to fall and hurt themselves. And the parent looks at me and says, what should I do? And I'm thinking, you're 2 feet taller than this person. But nobody wants to be the bad guy in our society. And then what happens is these little kids who are 15, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years old, they grow up and they're 5 and 6, and now they're bigger than you. My 13-year-old is 4.5 inches taller than me. I'm not spanking her.
Right.
So a lot of times the work is not being put in when these children are very small. They're allowed, because there's this idea in our society that you should be very open and just permissive is the only word I can use to describe it. It's like anything goes. The kid wants your phone. Okay, you can have my phone. Just be quiet. That kind of parenting, by the time you get a toddler, 3 or 4 years old, just doesn't work. So that's when we start having this conversation about spanking. And I think that's when it really comes in. We're not really talking about 15 and 16-year-olds. We're talking about those kids who are in the middle group. And it's just because people sometimes don't want to put in the work. And so they end up spanking as a last resort or out of frustration. So the conversation really is not about parenting. Not about spanking. It's about parenting. It got defaulted to spanking, but the conversation is really about parenting. So I have that conversation every day. What to do?
And I think that's an excellent point, right? Because you talk about, there's a spectrum of discipline. Corporal punishment happens to be one on that spectrum of discipline. But like you said, I think that's very true, right? It comes down to parenting and how do we help parents help their kids thrive, right? And I think taking those from what I've heard from the discussion, I think taking into account some of the systemic racism, cultural context, the individual child, and the nuances of knowing your child, right? That's when there's an opportunity, or the AAP has an opportunity to kind of look at those intersections and really have a true conversation about how do we really help parents help their kids, right, in a way, like, again, going back to helping them thrive.
Yeah, and how about we accept and understand that not all kids are the same and are going to respond to the same directives, and all parents aren't the same. What parenting style may work for this person, it may not work for me, or it may not work for my kids. I happen to be of the belief that if you start when they're really little and when they're young, so I'll give an example. My mother let me know that when I was very young, when I was little, whenever we went over someone's house, there was no childproofing the house. They didn't put things away. They didn't lock cabinets. You knew not to touch it. If you touched it, there were consequences. And so what my mother said to me was, okay, so when you have your children, I'm just telling you the same thing. Your kids aren't going to come over my house and touch things, bother things, go in places where they aren't supposed to be. Your kids should know where the boundaries are and what the boundaries are, and that there are consequences if they don't. And we did that. We never put things away. All the knickknacks and things that are out on our table have always been that way. We didn't lock cabinets. We didn't do a lot of the things that we tell people to do in their anticipatory guidance with parents, because I just kind of felt that if I put those boundaries out there for my kids, and if they understood that there were consequences if they went beyond those boundaries, and really they weren't, they're not, like you don't, the punishment needs to fit whatever the crime is, just for lack of a better word. Sometimes just a little thump on the knuckle, just a little something, so that they know, and you tell them, no, that's not acceptable. They learn and they get the message. And as they're growing up, you don't have to worry about it when they're 7, 8, 9 years old, that you have to thank them. By then, generally, they pretty much respect your directives, and you don't have to. I think it's easier, as Dr. Buffington was saying, when they're younger. So, again, I think understanding and accepting that there are different styles of parenting, that because I choose to parent my kids this way doesn't make me a bad parent, when I can look and say, well, I don't think I have a low IQ. I'm a pediatrician. Well, I think I would be pretty normal.
It's such a ridiculous statement. It's such a ridiculous statement.
Isn't it?
It makes you laugh. It's like the head circumference argument. It's just so ridiculous,
right,
to think that.
It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous statement, but they're using that. And I look at my kids. They're all doing very well. And then for you to put a directive out and say that if you use these methods of parenting, you're a bad parent, and your kids are going to come out bad because you use these methods. And I think if we understand that within certain, just as Shontae was saying, I'm in rural South, and I take care of primarily adolescents. I love that age group. But I'm in the rural South, and some of our conversations are really very different. I agree. In the rural, I don't care where you are. If you're in rural America, you're struggling. Academically, for job opportunities. There are all sorts of risk factors that face these kids that may be a little bit more prevalent in rural communities. So, I even think that wasn't even taken into account when we make these statements about how kids should be raised, just looking at the environment they're in and the tools that parents have to discipline their kids or how they want to do them. And I think that would be one way that, as an organization, we can help the people that we provide care for, the parents and the kids, because we have two sets of patients, right? We have parents and we have kids, is to be able to acknowledge cultural differences, to acknowledge parenting styles. And if you're going to say people who are authoritative or use corporal punishment, then you need to also say that parents that are free-range parents and permissive parents are also have cons to those parenting styles, can kind of cause harm to their kids. So, I'm just saying there's a balance, and to demonize one way of parenting when there's 4, 5, 6 different styles of parenting, to just deem this one as so, evil that we have to come out with this big statement, I just think doesn't do us. It doesn't help us as pediatricians to be able to provide the best care and recommendations for our families.
I think this will
Agreed.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, I have a colleague, I'm not going to say her name, but she was struggling with her 3-year-old twins, and every day she'd come to my office, what should I do? I said, you know what? I finally said, you just need to just one good time, just a little tap, and things will get better. And she looked at me. Remember, she's a pediatrician also, and kind of anti-spanking, but from the South. And 2 weeks later, she came down the hall and she said, you know what? I took your advice. Thank you. And I said, things are better. Yes, they are. I think every single aspect of the policy needs to be more well-defined. And I certainly think that it should not target any particular group, whether it's African American or lower socioeconomic, rural, any demographic. This one clearly targets a group of people, and I think for that reason it makes it wrong on so many levels. And if you're going to address that particular issue, you have to address a bunch of others.
Exactly. I just want to just make a just little light thing. One of the things when my kids were all small, and I had a little ruler, and the ruler, on the back of the ruler, I had the name. The ruler had a name. The ruler's name was Mr. Do Right. He was M.R., and then he was D.O., and his last name R.I.G.H.T. And it was a little ruler, one of those little plastic rulers. And so what I would tell them is, we're going out. We're out. If I have to tell you more than once to do something that you shouldn't be doing, then I'm going to have to bring this out so Mr. Do Right can show you the right way that you need to behave. And all I would have to do, so a couple of times, I tapped them a couple of times with it, so that they got the message. And, after a while they understood. If they weren't paying attention, or if they weren't minding me, if they were trying to act up, I would just, Mr. Do Right was in my purse. And I would just kind of bring him up a little bit, and I would just have them look at it, Mr. Do Right. They would sit right at attention, and people would say, how do you get your kids to sit so still? Mm-hmm. And that's just like one of those, like you said, it's just one of those things that you can do. It's a suggestion. I've made that suggestion to parents many times. That gives you a sense of control.
Isn't that a behavioral modification? That is a behavioral modification.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, like, not my daughter, she's the one, she pretty much did whatever she was told, but, the boys can be a little bit more rambunctious. And if you got a couple taps and you understood that if you weren't paying attention, or you weren't doing what I told you to do, or you weren't following my directions, Mr. Do Right was going to come out. You're exactly right. It changed behavior, modified behavior. And as they got older, you don't even need to do that. You give them, you just tell them, we're going in here. This is how you want to behave. And I'm saying, I don't think my kids are scarred for life. My kids aren't aggressive. None of my children ever got into fights in school. I mean, all these things they try to label kids who receive corporal punishment as part of the discipline in their home. I just don't know where they get all this from, and not take into account other factors that may contribute to those kids' behaviors. But my kids were never aggressive or hit other kids, or matter of fact, I'll tell you, the ones that had the parents that were permissive or free range, that never gave the kids directions, those were the kids that were biting other kids, hitting other kids, spitting on other kids. Those are the kids, and there's data to back that up. Those are the kids that actually are the ones that have the behavioral issues.
And let's be honest, this is an almost impossible study to do. I mean, you can do it, but you would have to control for quite a number of factors before you would be able to come to any logical scientific conclusion with a p-value that makes sense. You've got to control for a lot of factors.
Absolutely. Totally agree with you.
So I think this has been a very informative conversation, and I think what's left is that there really is more that has to be done, and what I'm getting from, like, more information has to be provided, more context, more cultural context and sensitivity around the discussion of spanking, not spanking, because it's not just a cut and dry spanking or not spanking. I think there are other factors. It's multifactorial, and I do think there's probably more to come. But I guess just to play fairness, well, not necessarily fairness, but I know there are parents who definitely would abide by this policy, and really think that spanking, they've chosen not to spank, and they've never spanked. I think if that's what works for those parents, I think that's important. But I think there is an opportunity to really have some of these deeper conversations that this opens.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I do like the comment I think we were talking about a little bit before we started our formal conversation. I know as a pediatrician, I had different views and different thoughts about parenting before I had children. Mm-hmm. And especially by the time the third one came around, I just had a whole different concept of of what I thought I should be doing to make sure I raise nice, healthy, happy kids. And I think, for us, we talk to other parents. We're parents. And, we evolve too. We're humans. We evolve too. But I will certainly say having children in my home 24/7 that are mine, that I can't give back to the neighbor, I can't give back to my relative, that they're actually my children, sort of, I made a stand that, my children need to be able to pay attention, understand directions, be good and respectful, which is what is ingrained in all of us. And I felt the way that, my husband and I, we both, even though we're from different places, we have very similar styles that we were raised, and we are 100% in agreement on how we discipline our kids. And it worked for us, and I don't think that I should be deemed a bad parent because I chose to use some method of corporal punishment in addition to other forms of discipline. And I think that's where we really could help parents. I will say this. There are more parents. I agree with Dr. Buffington made this comment earlier. More parents use corporal punishment than they want to admit because they don't want to have their kids taken away from them or be seen as bad parents. I think those parents need some support and some guidance as to maybe when you kind of go overboard and maybe when a spanking might be appropriate, or when they get too old. I agree. I'm not, when my sons got to be teenage, we're not going to fight. We're not doing that. But what we will do is we'll take the keys from the car, or we'll take away the PlayStation 4, or you'll read
books.
Which
is a behavioral modification.
Which is a behavioral modification.
Right. And I've done
we
that.
come back to that.
Yeah, you're right. But I think what you're alluding to as well is that, right, there's this toolbox, right? You got to know what tool to use, when to use a hammer, when to use a screwdriver, when to use a wrench. Okay, that's what the extent of my tool knowledge, right? But also to this, I think developmental stages also inform how we work with parents, and I think some of the value we have as our profession, that again, like, we can really help and guide parents as well as be a resource for them, so that to help them determine, what are the best tools to use, and again, also keeping in mind developmental stages and how you.
But Jackie, if you have a toolbox, you can't use a wrench when you're supposed to use a hammer.
Correct.
Right.
And you can't use a screwdriver when you're supposed to use a nail, because plenty of people use timeout and they do it all wrong. I see the kid in the timeout. They're like, "You're in timeout. Don't talk to me. No, stay there. And I'm thinking, that kid's not in timeout. So
that kid's not in timeout.
That's the kid's not in timeout. So but it's not just the toolbox. It's teaching parents how to use a screwdriver or an Allen wrench. What time, in Target, guess what? If I'm in Target with my kid, I'm not going to spank you. I have a different method in Target. I have a different method, a different behavioral modification than I might have if you ran across the street and there was a bus coming and you almost got hit. It's a totally different tool. I think the problem, the real problem, is that none of the tools really get expanded in the AAP. It's like, here, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. And so I find myself every day teaching parents, okay, if you're going to do a timeout, don't talk to the kid. How are you doing a timeout and y'all are talking? You can't argue.
And you're arguing with the kid. Right.
That's not how it works. The same way if you're spanking your child and you're using an electrical cord or, something crazy, and the kid's got marks all over them, that's actually not a spanking. That's straight up child abuse.
Exactly.
You got to expand that toolbox, and you got to teach people how to use it the same way. When you say, how do you use this bottle, you got to sometimes teach the mom how many scoops and how much water. You really have to go through that because some people get it wrong. So,
exactly right.
I think that's where the AAP has really gone wrong with this one. But it can be salvaged.
I think it would be really nice if the policy was revisited. And again, I'm just going to stick in just behind you, Shontae. I'm just going to stick in behind there and to understand that we don't raise our kids in a vacuum. That they go to school, they're around other kids, they're in different situations where they need to know how to behave appropriately, whatever that is. And I think that's another thing that people forget, that they're not being raised in a vacuum.
I think we'll leave it at that. I think there will be, like I said, there will be ongoing discussion, and my hopes are that there will be ongoing discussion from the American Academy of Pediatrics about, like you said, Dr. Buffington, expanding the policy. And it is salvageable. I think, we do our best to give the guidance that, again, it's a general statement, and we have to look at the nuances of each family. Each family is different. Child developmentally is different. Each child is different. So more to come. And this has been a great conversation. I'm so honored that you all have taken the time to speak with me today and give some enlightenment and some perspective.
Thank you. I enjoyed it as well.
Thank you, Jackie.
It was great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of What is Black Podcast. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review us. We're on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. Until next time.